Morning, Eights. This is Mr.Westra with Half Brother 32, which is the last one. There's only one part to this reading this time. To give you the heads up. Ben found out that Helson was going back on the agreement to agree to sell Zan. So in desperation, Ben took Zan out to the wilderness, and they were going to live in the wilderness for a while so Zan wouldn't have to go back to Dr. Helson's ranch. While he was out there, Mike and his friends found Zan and Ben there, and there was a standoff between Zan and Mike. Ben and Zan ended up scurrying into a tree, and as Ben was crawling up the tree, he slipped, and Zan grabbed a hold of Ben's hand and crushed and broke it. At which point, his buddy Tim showed up. Ben's buddy Tim showed up and scared them off. So here we go. We're going to pick it up and finish the book today. So here we go. Zan had broken every finger in my hand, even my thumb. He couldn't help it. He was just so strong. But he'd saved me from breaking a leg and probably my neck. He'd probably saved my life. I was in the hospital 2 days as they x-rayed my hand and discussed what was best and how successful they might be at repairing the damage. And then they decided I needed a little operation. I got put to sleep, and when I woke up, Mom and Dad and Peter were all there. My left hand was so wrapped up it looked like I was wearing an oven mitt. "Where's Zan?" I croaked. My mouth had never felt so dry. "Good news," said Mum with a smile. She took my good hand and pressed her cheek against mine. After all the bad hospital smells, her perfume was so good. "He doesn't have to go back to Helson," said Peter, beaming. "What happened?" I asked, trying to sit up. "The power of the media," said Dad, helping me. "It saved us in the end." After interviewing Helson, a reporter had somehow gotten hold of the letters between him and the Thurston Foundation all about the chimps Helson was offering for sale, which ones the foundation wanted to buy. There were letters haggling about the price until the last one we'd seen, where the foundation had made its final offer. They showed that letter on TV from coast to coast. Helson was insisting these letters were just discussions. No formal agreement had ever been reached, he said, and he was not doing anything that wasn't within his legal rights. But it made him look like a liar. And, thanks to William Eckler, the news station also showed some of the footage of the lab where Zan might end up. They showed the cages and the little baby chimps banging their bodies against the bars. Apparently, the newspapers and the TV stations received a ton of phone calls and letters. And the next day, Helson issued a statement. He said that, given my personal attachment to the chimp, he was willing to return Zan to me. I wondered how the reporter got those letters. Did someone at the Thurston Foundation leak them? Some researcher sick of seeing the suffering of the chimps? Or was it closer to home? Was it Sue Ellen, who'd grown up with Caliban and Igor and was starting to love Zan? Maybe she'd gone into her dad's office one night, stolen the letters, and given them to the newspaper. I guess we'd never know. I was just so grateful it worked out. 5 days later, we bought Zan back from Helson for $1. The last night Zan was with us, I put him to bed. I lay beside him with his blankets and toys and brushed his hair for a long, long time, and I told him the story of his life. "Here's the real story," I told him, "because maybe no one else will ever tell you. Your real mother lived in a lab, and she had you in a cage, and she loved you and fed you until Mum came along and stole you. And Mum brought you here, and gave you a room and a yard and food, and pretended that you were a real human and part of our family. Dad pretended to like you. Mum was really fond of you right away, and then she started loving you for real." I paused, because this part was hard to admit. "I didn't love you at first, Zan. I thought you were weird, and I guess I was jealous, and sometimes I didn't want you at all. But that didn't last long. You were my little brother. I really felt that. That was never fake." I don't know how much he understood. He understood a lot, much more than he could sign. But I think he was asleep long before I finished. Chapter 26. Sanctuary. Another private plane, more sweltering country roads, flat land on all sides. Zan asleep on my lap in the back seat. I still had a cast on my left hand. The doctors had x-rayed it a couple of more times, taken off one cast, reset a couple of fingers, put on a new cast. They talked about how, maybe, I'd never regain full use of my hand, my thumb especially. It might not work too well anymore. It was funny, because chimps had weak thumbs too. Look at them, and you could see how short they were compared to their other fingers. Often they used just their fingers to pick things up. I didn't mind if I had a chimp hand, Zan's hand. When we first pulled up at the sanctuary, my heart felt sick because it didn't look much different from Helson's ranch. Fences and big buildings with bars and high windows. But beyond the fences, I could see 5 islands in large ponds, and in the trees I saw the dark outlines of 2 chimps playing. Driving closer, we passed fields where there were huge wooden walkways and shaded platforms and ropes and planks and more chimps playing on them. Some of them looked pretty young, still with their white tail tufts, not much older than Zan. The woman who ran the sanctuary was named Margaret Inverness, and I liked her right away. She came out of the office in jeans and a t-shirt, and when she greeted us, I realized she'd been the person I talked to that first time on the phone. Mum and Dad and Peter were there, but it was me she looked at most as she showed us around the grounds and main building. Zan slept in my arms. There were still cages where the chimps slept and ate. There always had to be cages. When we arrived, it was lunchtime, and the volunteers were feeding them. They loaded trolleys with all sorts of drinks and fruits and vegetables and yogurts and other things. And the chimps could reach through these slots and just take what they wanted. Every cage had its own trolley. It was sort of like a rolling cafeteria. Above the cages were lofts, Above the cages were lofts where the chimps liked to sleep. And above those were bigger caged areas where they could also play and sleep together if they wanted. They had blankets and toys and all sorts of things to stimulate and comfort them. I watched the volunteers as they fed the chimps, and they really did seem to like them. They talked to the chimps and joked with them. The chimps were all ages and sizes. One guy kept clapping his hands to get a volunteer's attention, and she always seemed to know exactly what it was he wanted. There was a cage ready for Zan, and they let us put in his favorite blankets and toys and everything else he thought would make the transition easier. Now, there's some paperwork, said Margaret. We went into her office. It was a single piece of paper we had to sign. Mum and Dad read it, and so did Peter. What this says, Margaret told me, is that once you transfer Zan to us, we will never release him. Do you understand? I think so, I said. Zan was beginning to stir in my arms. That means we won't let anyone have him. Not a scientist or a zoo or a lab. Or you, Ben. You understand that, right? For a second, I couldn't say anything. Yeah, I said. Sure. So even if you change your mind and want Zan back, you can't have him. I nodded, and Dad signed the papers. We spent 3 days at the sanctuary, trying to make it easier for Zan. Or maybe it was to make it easier for us. It sure helped me to see that it was a good place for him, filled with people who really loved the chimps and wanted the best for them. I hoped it helped Zan too, us staying on a few days. On the last day, we left him in one of the play areas. We were all on the other side of the fence. That was one of the things about the sanctuary. There was no human-chimp contact unless the chimps were sick. You could touch them through the bars and groom their hands and backs if you knew them well enough. But there'd be no more teaching, no more signing. Zan was allowed to be just as he wanted. I bet he teaches some of the young ones signs, said Peter. I bet he does. Maybe he will, Dad said. Then one by one we slipped away. I was last. Zan came over for a tickle and hug through the fence. A couple of the other young chimps were bounding around on the play apparatus, and Zan kept looking over his shoulder to check on them. One hooted impatiently at him, and Zan looked at me one last time, then turned and scampered off. I watched him go and hoped that one day he'd forget that he was ever a human. A couple of nights later, after we got home, I dreamed about Zan. We were talking, signing, our hands flying to speak. I didn't understand how his vocabulary, or mine, had grown so much. There were no words we couldn't say to each other, and I felt such joy to be talking to him the way I'd always wanted to, all those months he'd been one of us. The sanctuary's okay, isn't it? I asked. I like it, he said. The food is excellent. If anything, they give us too much. I wish you could have stayed with us. A house can't hold me, he said. I'm going to get a lot bigger and a lot stronger. Probably smelly. I'm pretty rambunctious, too. I break things. It's fun. You should try it sometime. That time I ripped your kitchen cabinet off the wall, that was very satisfying. I never knew if you were angry or happy when you did that. I was having a ball, he replied. I liked it when you bit Ryan, I signed. Zan gave a little pant hoot. That was satisfying. But we can have big tempers. It's not safe for you to be around us. You'd never hurt me, I signed. But your hand. Well, it's pretty messed up, but you did save my life. But I could hurt you. Worse another time, he told me. We're not like you. We do things. I took a deep breath. Will you forget about us, I asked. We have long memories. It was hard for me to sign the next bit, but I did. It's probably best if you do. Forget about us. That's up to me, he said. It wasn't fair what we did to you, Zan. I'm sorry. He shrugged. I like the yogurt. You don't get that in the wild. I thought of something I'd said aloud to him many times, whispered to him as he fell asleep in my arms. But I'd never signed it, because Dad had never thought it was useful or important to teach him. For Zan, that phrase had never existed. I signed it now. For a long time, Zan's hands were still, and I felt sad. For a long time, Zan's hands were still, and I felt I'd said too much. I knew what I wanted him to sign back, but how could I expect it? We'd stolen him. We'd cheated him. We'd used him. We'd abandoned him. We told him to be something he wasn't, a human, and then told him to go back to being a chimp. He should have hated me. Zan's hands moved. With his index finger, he touched his breastbone. Then he crossed both wrists over his chest and finally pointed it to me. He made the B sign over my heart. He did it twice.